I remember when our eldest son Jacob was born, and leaving the hospital with him, and it's kind of like are they actually going to let us leave with this baby? Because honestly, we've got no idea what we're doing. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, well, like you have to get a license to drive. You know where I'm going with this. There's very few jobs, if any, that you can do without training. Even when you adopt an animal, they usually do a home check. Yet they'll let you go home from the hospital with a human being. Nobody asks any questions. It's like, you'll be fine. It'll be all right. You'll get used to it. But what if I'm not? And I had this picture as Christian was being wheeled towards the door of the hospital of her going like this, like, don't make me go. It's just that fear of the unknown. Nobody's told you what to do. The assumption is you'll just figure it out. You were a kid once, so you know what it's like to raise a kid. You'll be fine. I don't know if there's anything else where you don't need qualifications or experience with such a huge responsibility at the end of it. Because everything that we do requires some kind of training, whether that's actual on-the-job training or whether it's just observing somebody showing you how it's done. Everything that we do pretty much requires some kind of training. So imagine if Jesus had turned up out of nowhere, did a few miracles, just hung out, basically, didn't really do much, and he said, all right, I'm going to head out now. You guys, you're on your own. And the disciples would be like, you what now, Jesus? What are we supposed to do? And it's like, I don't know, just like go and make disciples or whatever. But Jesus had spent 3 years, at least 3 years, training the disciples. That's enough for a university degree in England. You could have a Bachelor of Discipleship at the end of that. And Jesus tells his disciples to make disciples. So he's saying to them, do what I've just been doing with you. Now you go and do that with other people. A discipleship in Jesus' day, my watch is actually, this is the first time I've preached with a Fitbit watch. It's a bit concerned about my heart rate, I think, right now. Discipleship in Jesus' day. Let's just bring up this slide. Now, it's not going to be very clear to you, but it's a cycle, right? That it starts with personal sacrifice, right? You have to choose to follow somebody. You follow them, you can imitate them, you get spiritual transformation, and then you pass it on, and that goes on and on and on, right? So that line between pass it on and follow, it's still there, because it's basically like you're not done. You're not done with discipleship once you're, ready to disciple other people. It's an ongoing cycle. And that's how we got here today. Yeah, think about that for a second. Right, it started with Jesus, and then it went to the disciples. And then it went on, and it went on, and it went on, and it went on, and it went on. And that's how we're here today. That's how discipleship works. Paul is a great example of first century discipleship. In Acts 22, he's speaking to the angry mob in Jerusalem, and he's convincing them that he must be okay. He's both a Roman and a Jew, so therefore he's pleasing everybody. He says, I'm a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, that's Jerusalem, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. Right? So Paul's saying, I'm like you guys. There's no difference between who I am. That was so subtle, Shauna. Just do an army crawl next time. So Paul was a disciple of Gamaliel, and he identified with the Pharisees, right? He imitated his teachers. That was how he was discipled. But Paul didn't find spiritual transformation until he came face to face with Jesus on the road to Damascus. And he saw that blinding light and heard that voice from heaven. And Paul talks about this, and he talks about it in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about how the Lord appeared to the disciples after the resurrection. And he says, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. That's Paul's experience on the road to Damascus. He met Jesus face to face. And then in 2 Corinthians, it's chapter 12, and it's that kind of tricky passage, but Paul talks about being taken up into the third heaven and meeting Jesus there in paradise, right? So he talks about a man, and then he talks about himself being that man. Paul identifies himself as meeting Jesus face to face, and this is what qualifies Paul to be one of the apostles. And what does Paul do with this? What does he do? He goes to Damascus, and then he's a disciple there, and then he goes out, he passes it on, right? Paul is a great example of what discipleship looked like in the first century. And what he says in 1 Corinthians 11, he says, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. It doesn't say be imitators of Christ. He says, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. I've met Christ. I've met him face to face. I know who he is. I know what he's like. But you don't. So imitate me as I imitate Christ. And there we go with the imitation part of discipleship. And as I was thinking about Paul, I was thinking about the other New Testament writers. So this is a bit of an aside. Let's just think about who they were, right? So we've got Matthew, John, and Peter, all disciples of Jesus. And we've got, and I'm including the Gospel of Mark in that because Peter is the inspiration to Mark. We've got Paul, of course, who was an apostle. And we've got James and Jude, and their relationship with Jesus is a little bit different, right? They're Jesus' brothers. They rejected Jesus until the resurrection and the ascension, and then we see them being part of the church. Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, and he writes an orderly account. He goes out and he interviews people who've met Jesus. He writes them down in his letter to Theophilus. And then we've got Hebrews. And we don't know who the writer of Hebrews is, but it sounds so much like Paul that everybody thought it was Paul for the longest time. So he's clearly a disciple of Paul. So what we find in all of the New Testament writers is that either they knew Jesus or they knew somebody who knew Jesus. And now they're passing it on. They've been discipled. They've been in that place of following Jesus or following somebody who imitates Jesus. And now they pass it on. Spiritual transformation leads to helping others to grow. The disciple becomes the discipler. And Jesus says in his best dad joke, he says, follow me and I will make you fishers of men, right? The fishermen are going to become fishers of men. The disciples are going to become disciplers. And discipleship is nothing without spiritual transformation. And I warned Micah I was going to use him as an example this morning. Micah works at McDonald's, and he went in for a few days training. And when he came home from the training each day, he did not say, Dad, my life has been transformed. Right? Because there's training that teaches you how to do something, and there's training that transforms you. And when that training is in Jesus, it's a spiritual transformation. Paul didn't hit his spiritual transformation until he met Jesus. If Paul had stayed a disciple of Gamaliel, we wouldn't know him today. He'd just be another first century Pharisee. But Paul says, I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. That's his spiritual transformation. He took on the identity of Christ, which is why he can say, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Because Paul is a disciple of Jesus. Now, when we compare ourselves to Jesus, we're always going to fall short. We will never be Christ, but we can be more and more Christ-like. So how much like Jesus should we become? Should we all become Jewish itinerant preachers? Maybe somebody might want to do that. That's not necessarily for all of us, though. But what Jesus says is, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. So his expectation of a disciple is to bear your own cross and pursue him no matter what. To be that much like Jesus, not just the cool stuff. And when I say not just the cool stuff, this is what Jesus says. This should be one of the scariest passages that we could read. And we find it in Matthew chapter 7. Jesus says, "Many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" Because knowing Jesus is not enough. We need to seek him, pursue him, and grow into his likeness. We need to be his disciples. Now, I don't want to scare you. This isn't the start of the message, but I'm going to go to our passage now. And we find it in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 to 16. "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Jesus is talking to his followers, his literal disciples. Be salt and be light to others, right? It's no good being salt or being light and nobody else sees it, nobody knows of it. Like, what does that even mean? Like, how could you, it's like if a light shines in the darkness and nobody's there to see it, is it really shining? Or something like that, right? Like, other people need to see the salt and the light in you. We've kind of beaten this passage to death over the last couple of weeks. There's not much more to exegete from this passage. But in order for salt to be effective, it has to be consumed. And I'm going to make an important note here. It has to be consumed in small quantities. And we'll come back to that. Disciples are to be a light, to shine in the darkness. Darkness doesn't consume light unless it's a black hole. Darkness doesn't consume light, right? That's just not a thing. Light shines in darkness. It overcomes darkness. Darkness is actually a lack of light. It's not a thing in itself, right? It's a lack of light. So we're to be salt and light, not just to the world, but to each other. Each other. To be the love of Jesus to each other, to show each other that same self-sacrificial love that Jesus showed to his disciples. That's a tall ask. Especially as we still need to go to work, we still need to cut our grass, and we still need to make dinner. Right? So we read about Jesus, and we read about followers of Jesus, and they were all in. That was their life. Is that expected of us? Is that what we're to do? Is we just to give up everything and only follow Jesus? Or do we have other responsibilities that we need to fulfill? Well, discipleship looks quite different as a 21st century Western Christian. And I'll say Western because I think it looks very different the world over. But in the Western world, so the center of the universe, Great Britain, and west of there, that's what we're talking about as the Western world. And it doesn't look like following Kevin everywhere. Although you could, I don't recommend it. He's a great example of Jesus. But I don't recommend sitting at the feet of Kevin and learning from Kevin every day and imitating Kevin and becoming more like Kevin as Kevin is like Jesus. Carl is a different matter, but that's just Kevin. But it does look like imitating the Christ-likeness in others. There's something that's appealing, something that's beautiful, something that is clearly out of this world and godly about some people. I just happened to look at you, Ed, at that point. Maybe it's fortuitous, I don't know. Imitating those things in each other that we see that reflect Jesus, that's part of being a disciple. It's about growing together, like Kevin read this morning, as iron sharpens iron, so one person can sharpen another. Now, I'm not an expert on sharpening iron, but I think I'd use like a grindstone or something, right? That's what I would do. I would use like a really hard rock to sharpen iron. But what's great about iron sharpening iron is that it's equal. There's no greater and lesser. They're equal to each other. Discipleship happens in an equal relationship. Somebody might be at the top of a mountain and somebody might be at the bottom of the pit. You can still disciple each other because you both have those experiences of who Jesus is in your life. So it's about being salt. And I was thinking, what does it mean to be the salt? And I think, you don't eat a meal of salt, but salt adds an essence to a meal. To be the salt needs to be like the essence of Christ and a light to each other. That's a much clearer metaphor. To shine the light of Jesus into the darkness that we carry around with us. James says to confess your sins to one another, and Peter calls the church a royal priesthood. You can intercede for one another. That's not Kevin or Carly's job. That's all of us for each other. You are to be a disciple and a discipler. Now, just to embarrass somebody else here, Gary White, last week, I just went to have a chat with him, and it turned out to be more of a discipleship session. Like you all know, I mean, those of you that know Gary will know that he's the gentlest person that you could meet. And when he corrects something in you, he does it out of love, and you know that you've been corrected and that something needs to change. I just went for a chat. That's just one example, right? That's the macro level. That's the big picture of what happens when we come together as the church body. As we gather together, we have those instances of discipling each other and being discipled. And as a church, that is our highest level of gathering. Discipleship does happen, but generally it's more on a corporate level. And at First Baptist, we have our next level of gathering, which is what we call either community groups or neighborhood groups. Don't get hung up on the name. And discipleship can be part of that in the same way that it is when we gather corporately. It happens as we rub shoulders with those in our community that oftentimes we wouldn't normally hang out with. And it happens as we go out into our community and serve together. But discipleship really happens on the micro level, when we trust one another. Now, only Jesus can handle 12 people at once, but even Jesus had his inner group, Peter, James, and John. The four of them met regularly as a focus group. Now, it doesn't matter what you call that gathering, but it's important that you do it. And it doesn't have to be within your community group, but it helps if it is. The important thing is that you seek out 2 or 3 people who you either know already or feel comfortable getting to know you intimately. That's why it helps if it's within a community group, because it gives you a head start. There's less of a pull in different directions. Now, my role here is the Belong team leader. And I want to ensure that the church meets your needs in regards to discipleship. So I encourage you to seek out those relationships. First, to look within your community group. Who are those people who can disciple you, who you can disciple? And if you're not in a community group, come talk to me or Pastor Carly. And if you're at a complete loss, but you know that you need discipleship, come talk to me and I will seek out those relationships with you. Because discipleship is a non-negotiable of life. In these days of social media, it takes a click to follow someone. But it takes a lot more than that to follow Jesus. It takes self-sacrifice to bear your own cross and follow him. And let's be clear about bearing your own cross. That's not just like a minor ailment that you struggle with. That's a burden that goes with you everywhere you go. And that burden is to be the salt and light to one another. Have people in your life that will guide you, that will disciple you. And maybe there's people you know who are like Jesus, and you can imitate them until you figure it out, until you reach spiritual transformation. And a disciple is also a discipler. We're called to be salt and light, and to pass it on, to be a consumable amount of Jesus to those around us, and to shine, to be glorious in a world that needs to see who Jesus really is. Amen.